The Senate chamber hummed with a restless energy, but all eyes turned when Senator John Neely Kennedy rose from his desk. His voice, tinged with the gravelly Louisiana drawl that had become his trademark, carried over the marble walls with cutting precision. Across the aisle sat Senator Ted Cruz, his posture stiff, his expression calculated. Kennedy didn't waste time on pleasantries. He aimed straight at the heart of Cruz's reputation, the infamous Cancun scandal. "Senator Cruz," Kennedy began, his eyes narrowing, "when Texans were freezing in the dark, you were soaking in the sun. While families huddled under blankets and children shivered without power, you boarded a plane to Cancun. And now you want this body to trust your word on national crises?" The chamber rippled with murmurs. Cruz shifted uncomfortably, a practiced half-smile tugging at his lips as cameras zoomed in. He had rehearsed defenses before, talking about being a father, about trying to care for his family, but Kennedy wasn't leaving him that room. Kennedy's tone hardened, each syllable like a hammer striking steel. "Leadership is not about running when the storm hits. Leadership is standing in the cold with your people and fighting for solutions. You, sir, abandoned them." The weight of Kennedy's words silenced the hall. Even those accustomed to Cruz's combative style waited for his rebuttal. Cruz leaned into the microphone, trying to inject charm. "Senator Kennedy, with respect, I was in communication the whole time. My constituents knew I was working on solutions." Kennedy's eyes blazed. "Solutions from a resort poolside? That isn't leadership. That's cowardice disguised as convenience. And the American people aren't buying it." The clash wasn't just political, it was personal. Kennedy had framed Cruz not as a senator with differing views, but as a man who failed when his state needed him most. The opening salvo had landed, and the chamber knew this exchange would only escalate from here. Cruz tightened his jaw, gripping the edges of the polished mahogany desk before him. He had weathered tough debates before, but Kennedy's direct assault carried a sting no spin doctor could soften. The Cancun scandal was more than a headline, it had become a symbol of abandonment, and Kennedy was weaponizing it with ruthless precision. "Senator Kennedy," Cruz began, his voice heavy with forced calm, "I admit my decision to travel during that storm wasn't my finest moment. But let's not pretend I wasn't working for Texans. My office coordinated relief, we engaged FEMA, we." Kennedy cut him off like a whip cracking through the chamber. "Coordinated? Engaged? You didn't stand shoulder to shoulder with the linemen risking frostbite, with the nurses boiling water to sterilize instruments, or with the single mothers burning furniture just to keep their kids warm. You left. And the people of Texas will never forget it." Gasps and whispers surged through the chamber. The bluntness of Kennedy's attack left no room for Cruz to retreat into practiced rhetoric. Cruz forced a chuckle, aiming to play it off. "Senator, the people of Louisiana may appreciate your flair for theatrics, but Texans understand." Kennedy slammed his hand on the desk, his southern cadence sharpening like a blade. "This isn't theater. This is about trust. When the storm came, you chose comfort over duty. You left millions behind while you walked sandy beaches. That's not the mark of a senator, it's the mark of a deserter." The word deserter echoed like a gunshot. Even senators who rarely broke rank shifted uncomfortably. Kennedy's framing painted Cruz not merely as negligent, but as unfit. Cruz's smile faltered, his shoulders tightening as cameras zoomed in on his discomfort. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice low but searing. "Tell me, Senator, when the next crisis comes, will you fight, or will you run again?" The silence that followed was deafening, and Cruz had no easy answer. Cruz cleared his throat, his polished mask of composure slipping with every second. The chamber's cameras zoomed in, broadcasting his unease to millions watching. He straightened his tie, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Senator Kennedy," Cruz said, his tone straining for authority, "I've spent my career fighting for Texans. I've stood against Washington overreach, against reckless spending, against those who forget who they serve. A vacation, ill-timed as it was, doesn't erase decades of service." Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with a kind of cold amusement. "Decades of service," he repeated slowly, his drawl wrapping around the words. "Let me tell you what the people remember, Ted. They don't remember your floor speeches or your sound bites on cable news. They remember pipes bursting in their homes while you were sipping cocktails in Cancun. They remember your neighbors sharing food in the cold while your family walked past resort pools. That's the legacy that'll follow you. The words hit Cruz like stones, and murmurs filled the Senate gallery. Kennedy's tone wasn't theatrical, it was surgical, cutting straight through Cruz's attempt at deflection. Trying to reclaim ground, Cruz jabbed back. With respect, Senator, Louisiana has had its share of crises too. Are you saying you've never made a mistake under pressure? Never once failed your people? Kennedy's lips curved into a thin smile. Difference is, Ted, I make my mistakes standing beside my people, not running from them. You don't measure a senator by the speeches he gives when the sun is shining. You measure him by where he stands when the storm hits. And you, Senator, weren't even in the country. A hush blanketed the room. The cameras lingered on Cruz's face, his jaw tight, his brow creased. Kennedy had turned his defense into a confession, reframing the Cancun trip as an unforgivable betrayal. Kennedy's voice dropped, steady and deliberate. You want redemption? Start by admitting the truth. You abandoned your post. Own it. The chamber erupted in murmurs again. Cruz's silence said more than any rebuttal could. The Senate chamber buzzed with a tension that felt almost electric. Staffers shifted nervously, reporters' pens scratched against notepads, and the gallery leaned forward as if history itself was being written. Cruz fidgeted, his hands clasped tightly on the desk before him. He opened his mouth to speak, but Kennedy's voice cut through like a whip. Ted, this isn't about one bad trip. This is about a pattern. Every time responsibility comes knocking, you find a way to slip out the back door. Folks don't want excuses, they want a leader who shows up. The words were raw, but they carried the weight of authenticity. Kennedy wasn't speaking like a rival senator, he was channeling the voices of ordinary Americans who had endured the storm. Cruz, his face flushed, leaned forward. That's a gross oversimplification, Senator. You're weaponizing a moment of human error to score political points. Texans don't want theatrics, they want results. And I've delivered results. Kennedy tilted his head, unimpressed. Results, he echoed. His hand tapped the table rhythmically as though measuring each word. Tell that to the families who burned furniture to stay warm. Tell it to the mother who wrapped her newborn in towels because the heat went out. You were supposed to be their shield, Ted, and instead you vanished. The gallery gasped softly, the image of those stories striking deeper than any policy debate ever could. Kennedy's storytelling wasn't just rhetoric, it was an indictment etched in human suffering. Cruz tried to rally, forcing a chuckle. I came back, didn't I? I worked around the clock with my team to help my constituents. Kennedy leaned in now, his eyes sharp, his voice a low growl. You came back when the cameras found you at the airport, luggage in hand, like a guilty man caught red-handed. Leadership isn't about getting shamed into action, it's about never leaving in the first place. A ripple of applause broke out in the gallery before the gavel slammed to restore order. But the damage was done. The perception had shifted. Cruz wasn't the fighter he claimed to be, he was the man who fled. And Kennedy? He was the one who forced the truth into the light. The tension in the chamber had thickened into something nearly tangible. Cruz straightened his tie, his jaw tight, as if bracing himself for another blow. He forced a smile, that familiar politician's grin, and raised his voice so the gallery and the cameras could catch every syllable. Senator Kennedy, you love grandstanding. But let's be clear, I didn't abandon Texas. I was in constant communication with local officials. I helped coordinate relief. And unlike some, I don't turn personal tragedy into a political circus. A murmur rippled through the room, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads. Cruz was playing defense, but his words rang hollow under the weight of what everyone had seen. Kennedy didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded calmly, his drawl measured and deliberate. Ted, I ain't here for theatrics. I'm here because when my people are hurting, I don't need to coordinate from afar. I sit with them. I stand with them. I shovel the snow, I hand out the water, I do what needs doing. He paused, letting the silence sharpen the blow. You sat poolside. The chamber erupted in whispers, a few stifled laughs breaking through. Cruz's face darkened, his composure slipping. He slammed his hand on the desk. That's an unfair caricature. You know it, and the American people know it. Leadership isn't about optics, it's about outcomes. Kennedy's eyes narrowed, his tone turning icy. Optics? He leaned forward, pointing a steady finger toward Cruz. Optics are when you wear a hard hat for a photo op. Optics are when you pretend to care for the cameras. But when pipes are bursting, and children are freezing, being in Cancun ain't optics, Ted, it's abandonment. The word hung in the air like a verdict. Abandonment. It wasn't just accusation, it was branding, a scarlet letter Kennedy pressed firmly onto Cruz's reputation. For a moment, Cruz had no comeback. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The gavel struck again, but the echo only underscored what everyone already knew. Cruz had been cornered, not by theatrics, but by truth. Cruz's silence lasted only a moment, but in politics, even a pause can feel like an eternity. Cameras zoomed in on his tightened jaw, the sweat forming at his temple, the forced composure unraveling under the weight of Kennedy's words. The gallery sensed it, the shift in momentum. Cruz finally leaned forward, his voice rising, desperation cloaked as indignation. Senator Kennedy, I will not be lectured by someone who confuses folksy soundbites with real governance. Texas doesn't need a preacher with punchlines. It needs leaders who get results. Kennedy chuckled, shaking his head slowly, his Louisiana drawl slicing through the chamber like a knife. Results? Ted, the only result folks in Texas remember is you dragging a suitcase through an airport while their lights were out and their homes were colder than a meat locker. The crowd gasped, a few snickers echoing before the gavel banged again. Kennedy pressed on, his voice calm but merciless. You talk about leadership. Leadership ain't about disappearing when the storm hits. Leadership ain't about blaming your wife, your kids, or anybody else. Leadership is staying put when it hurts the most and proving your word means something. Cruz's face flushed, the memory of his public apology, where he had said he only flew down because his daughters wanted a trip, burned fresh in everyone's mind. Kennedy pounced on it. And let's be real honest, Ted. You threw your own children under the bus to cover your hide. What kind of father, what kind of man, does that? The chamber erupted in low gasps, a mix of shock and approval. Cruz slammed a fist on the desk. That's below the belt, he shouted. Kennedy didn't blink. His voice dropped to a deadly calm, the kind that demanded attention. No, Senator. Freezing in your own home while your senator soaks in the sun, that's below the belt. I'm just reminding folks who cut and ran when it mattered. The silence afterward was suffocating. Cruz looked cornered, his polished defenses stripped bare, while Kennedy sat steady, unshaken, the embodiment of a man who hadn't just won the exchange, but owned it. The chamber buzzed with tension, but Kennedy wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed squarely on Cruz, every word heavy, deliberate. Ted, you've made a career out of talking tough on TV, railing against elites, pretending you're the voice of the common man. But when the storm came, you showed folks the truth. You're more worried about hotel reservations in Cancun than heating bills in Houston. Cruz tried to interject, raising a hand as if to swat Kennedy's words out of the air. That's a mischaracterization, Senator. I returned within 24 hours and immediately began coordinating relief efforts. Texans know where my heart is. Kennedy smirked, shaking his head. Your heart? Ted, your heart was in a 5-star resort while your state was drowning in crisis. And don't dress it up like charity work. You came back because you got caught. The truth is plain as day, you weren't leading, you were hiding. Laughter rippled through the gallery before being hushed. Even members of Cruz's own party looked down, avoiding his eyes. Kennedy's words weren't just cutting, they were undeniable. Cruz's voice wavered as he tried to recover. "I've dedicated my life to Texas, to its people. My record speaks louder than any cheap shots thrown in this chamber." Kennedy's drawl grew sharper. "A record, huh? Then let's talk about that record. Every time working families needed help, you found a way to block it. But when Wall Street donors needed protection, you were first in line. Texans don't need a senator who vanishes in a blackout and reappears only when the cameras do." The room fell into uneasy silence. Kennedy leaned back, his expression calm, collected, almost surgical in his dismantling of Cruz's defense. The Louisiana senator hadn't just poked at Cruz's Cancun scandal, he had reframed it into a symbol of everything Cruz's critics had always suspected: self-interest dressed up as service. Cruz shifted in his chair, the weight of the accusation pressing down harder with each passing second. And Kennedy knew he had struck the nerve that could not be patched with rehearsed lines or political spin. Cruz's composure cracked further as Kennedy pressed on, his tone even but razor-sharp. "You like to paint yourself as a constitutional warrior, Ted, but let's call things what they are. A man who leaves his people freezing in the dark isn't a warrior, he's a deserter." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Cruz's lips tightened, his face flushed. "That's an outrageous slander. I've fought for Texas every single day." Kennedy raised a hand, silencing him with the authority of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to say. "Texans don't need a speech, Ted. They need a senator who doesn't book flights when the lights go out. You had a choice: stand in the cold with your people, or sit in the sun with tourists. You chose the sun. And no amount of excuses will erase that picture of your rolling luggage in the airport." The chamber erupted with murmurs. Some senators smirked knowingly, others avoided Cruz's eyes. Cameras zoomed in on Cruz, catching the twitch in his jaw as Kennedy's words cut deeper than any headline ever had. Kennedy leaned back, his voice dropping into that slow Louisiana drawl that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Public service ain't a vacation, Ted. It's sacrifice. And when the test came, you failed it in front of the whole world. That's not leadership, it's cowardice." The silence was suffocating. Cruz opened his mouth but nothing came out. His trademark bluster had deserted him, leaving only a faint, nervous smile that did little to mask the sting of Kennedy's rebuke. Kennedy folded his hands, his gaze unwavering. He had dismantled Cruz not with volume, but with undeniable truth, a truth that now hung in the chamber like a heavy curtain no one dared move. The weight of Kennedy's words lingered in the Senate chamber like smoke after a fire. Cruz shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasping and unclasping as if searching for an anchor. For once, his usual arsenal of quips and counterpunches seemed empty. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the rare image of a man cornered by his own record. Kennedy, sensing the silence was his to command, pressed forward with the precision of a trial lawyer delivering his closing argument. "Ted, Texans weren't asking for miracles during that storm. They weren't demanding perfect answers. They just wanted to know that the man they elected would stand shoulder to shoulder with them, in the cold, in the dark, in the uncertainty. Instead, you stood at a departure gate." The audience gallery murmured, reporters scribbling furiously as Kennedy's words landed blow after blow. A young intern whispered to another, "This is going to be the headline tomorrow." Cruz tried to rally, his voice pitched higher than usual. "Senator Kennedy, you don't understand the circumstances, my family was." Kennedy cut him off smoothly, the corner of his mouth curling into a humorless smile. "Your family?" Every Texan family was huddled in their homes, boiling snow for water. "Don't tell me about family when every family back home was in crisis, and you thought the best thing to do was sneak off south. That ain't leadership, Ted. That's abandonment." A ripple of applause broke out from the gallery before the presiding officer pounded the gavel for order. But the moment was already seared into memory. Kennedy had stripped Cruz of his armor in front of the nation. Cruz's shoulders sagged ever so slightly. For once, the Texan firebrand looked small under the Senate lights. The Senate chamber sat in heavy silence, the kind that follows when truth cuts so deep that even partisanship feels small. Cruz's eyes darted downward, his usual bravado stripped away. He shifted his papers, pretending to read, but everyone in the room knew, there was nothing left to say. Kennedy adjusted his glasses, his voice dropping lower, steadier, almost pastoral now, but no less sharp. Leadership isn't about vacations, Ted. It's about responsibility. When folks are freezing in their homes, when the lights go dark and the shelves go empty, they don't need a senator who books a flight. They need one who stands in the storm with them. The words echoed like a verdict. Cameras flashed, journalists already racing to frame the narrative. Kennedy eviscerates Cruz on Senate floor. Across social media, clips of the exchange spread like wildfire, users reposting the moment Cruz froze under Kennedy's unflinching stare. Cruz finally opened his mouth, but no sound came, his usual weapons of sarcasm and spin reduced to silence. Kennedy didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply gathered his notes, turned toward the chamber, and added one final line. History remembers the storms, Ted. But it never forgets who ran from them. The gavel fell. The session moved on. Yet for millions watching, that last sentence was the exclamation point, the defining blow that would follow Cruz far longer than the Cancun headlines ever had. Senator Kennedy didn't just confront Ted Cruz, he buried the excuses once and for all. In a chamber built on words, it was Kennedy's truth that silenced the noise. Cruz may have tried to escape the storm, but Kennedy made sure the whole country remembered that real leaders don't run. They stand, they fight, and they answer to the people. In the end, Kennedy's words weren't just aimed at Cruz, they were a warning to every politician hiding behind excuses: history will find you, and it won't be kind.